this with you guys again. And as Kevin said, we're going to be doing this twice. So we're sort of working out the best way to do this logistically. And if we don't get a chance to get to something this time, then if you let us know that, that can be something that if you choose to attend it again, or just kind of let us know ahead of time, and we'll make sure to get to that. And I'll get to be spending some time with you for some other trainings too, I believe. So anyway, we'll have lots of chances to do this, but I'm very excited to be with you guys today. And just a tiny little bit of agenda so you kind of know what we're going to be doing. I'll be talking with you guys until about 10:35 or so, since we're starting a little bit late. We will take a 10-minute break. We'll then go for about another 45 minutes. You'll have your lunch break, which I think we'll do for about 20 minutes, because I know you guys can like get food and sit and watch, which I think is really nice. And you don't have to worry about sharing your chips or cookies with me, which totally would happen if we were doing this live. So we'll be pretty relaxed about that. And then we'll take a third quick 10-minute break as we get through the afternoon. So I'll make sure to break this up and you guys can move and do stuff. In the meantime, especially because this is a remote, I know it's really tempting to be sort of, watching emails or taking texts or whatever, doing a little online shopping, whatever it is during this training. And I know that there are folks in the training today who are on call or there's stuff going on. So absolutely, if you need to step out and do something, please feel free to do that. If you're not in that position and you have a little bit of space today, I'm going to suggest something, and that is you put your phone away. For me, it is a constant temptation to be distracted and to do what I think of as multitasking. But what we know from the research is that we can't actually multitask the way that word sounds. We don't do two things simultaneously in our brain in terms of what we pay attention to. We can only switch attention back and forth very quickly, which is actually really tiring. And I used to think I was really good at multitasking. And the truth is, when you test people, their scores always go down on a task if they're doing two things at once. It's just how our brains work. And I think that we're given so many messages about cramming as much into our day as possible and do your banking while you're getting gas. It's crazy. And that's a topic for another day. We will actually come back to it when we talk about self-care. But in terms of this training today, I really want to offer you an invitation to not be secretly doing paperwork or notes, not be checking your messages, not be on Amazon or anything like that, but to just be present. If you want to take notes, if that's helpful to you, I suggest that you do that, preferably with pen and paper if that's available to you. But also know that you will have the manual, which covers everything we're talking about. Kevin would like me to tell you at this point also that you can buy the book that was published in January this year if you want to read further. And we will be meeting again. We will have other times together. So if it works for you, maybe take this time just for yourself today, just to be present, just to listen, just to learn, and see if that's a little bit of a break for your brain from all the multitasking. So commercial over for that, and we will now jump into it. So those of you who have done this with me before, or see me at conferences, you may know that technology and I have a very love-hate relationship. So I want everybody to take a moment, just gather yourself, maybe get quiet, connect to whatever spirituality or practice you have, and send up a little prayer or good thought, because I'm about to try to share my slides. So let's all come together, and with your collective goodwill, I believe this can work. So I'm going to do this, and I can't because I am a participant and not a panelist, so I can't share my screen. So hopefully Kevin can fix that. In the meantime, I'm going to start by talking about what it is that informs how we're going to be talking about trauma. And I'm just going to make sure that Kevin heard that and knows that that's happening. So when I talk about trauma, it's helpful to know my background. I kind of grew up as a mental health person. I'm a psychotherapist. I have an MSW, and I've always been interested in trauma and clinical work around that. Started out working with teens and women's issues and that stuff. And then when my friend Kevin was running policy for the state of Ohio in the Department of DD, I got an offer to come be kind of a liaison between developmental disabilities and mental health. And I didn't know anything about developmental disabilities at the time, like nothing. So I was very excited for this opportunity, but I was also a bit intimidated, to be honest with you, because I figured that there was this whole new science and art of what psychiatric issues and mental health issues might be for people with developmental disabilities. And what I found, and what has been confirmed for me over and over and over and over, is that yes, there are some things that are different, usually in terms of situations, how people with dual diagnoses live, where they live, how much power and choice they have in their own lives, how vulnerable they are to trauma. And we'll talk about all of those things. But the main thing I learned is that we are all far, far, far more alike than we are different. So as we spend this time talking about trauma, I will talk about some things that make it harder if you have developmental disabilities, or that may make you more vulnerable to things or what have you. But we have no research or science that suggests that being terrified and powerless is any different based on your IQ. Right, or based on whether or not you can read or write, that there are only so many things that a human brain and body can do to respond to a threat, or to deal with chronic levels of toxic stress. Our brains are much more similar than they are different. And so we're not going to be talking about trauma as if it's this different beast, right? It's really just about humans. Now, in the course of doing this, there may be some things that you connect to in your professional experience or even your personal experience. And if that's useful, great. If anything starts to feel too intense or connects a little too deeply for you, then please feel free to get up, go get some water, take a break, do what you need to do to take care of yourself as we go through this. So I am going to try sharing my screen again, and now it's working. Yay. So we'll go ahead and do that. And we're going to put all this stuff down, and I'm going to open this slideshow and start it from the beginning, and hopefully everybody can see this, and someone will tell me if you can't. Okay, so we are going to quickly go through a lot of this material. And again, if there's something that you want me to come back to and spend more time with during the breaks, that's a great time to get that to Kevin and let me know, and I will make sure to do that. But I do want to start with these quotes because they really set the stage for how we understand trauma and kind of where we are in the science in terms of what we know about what's happening and what are effective ways to approach this. So Tamsin Cottis is a psychoanalyst and mental health professional in London, England. And she may still do this, I don't know, but she, for many years, ran a mental health clinic just for people with developmental disabilities, which is amazing. Imagine if you could go to, like, I don't know, let's say Fort Wayne or Indianapolis, and there's a whole mental health center just for your clients. It'd be incredible. But anyway, this is what she wrote in her book about that experience and her clinical insights into that. It is worth noting at this point that many patients referred to their clinic seem to have become disabled more by their traumatic life experience than by any congenital impairment. So imagine that for a second. Imagine that there is a new individual who's come for service, and let's say it's me, and the first thing you learn about me is not the chromosomal syndrome I was born with, not my IQ or any of that stuff. The first thing you learn is my trauma history, if it's known, or you learn what seems to make me scared and what seems to help me feel safe and comfortable. That's the most important information. Now, I'm not saying that the other stuff isn't also important. Of course it is. But imagine if our first knowledge of this individual and how we begin thinking about staffing and planning and supports starts there. That would be a complete reversal of how we think about trauma right now. Now, thankfully, trauma is much more a part of the conversation than it's ever been, but it's still sort of an add-on. So this really centers how impactful trauma has been. It's not the Fragile X, it's not the autism, it's not the Down syndrome that is, really causing me trouble day to day as much as trauma, how I've been treated by other human beings. And now to dig in a little more about what it is that we're talking about when we talk about trauma, if you have, oh, my screen went away. I don't know why. Let me see if it'll come back. For some reason, I can't share my screen anymore. I don't know why that is. So maybe something changed. I don't know if you guys can, okay, let me try again. We'll do this again. There it is. Okay. So when we talk about trauma, what we're talking about, I think, is summed up by Bessel van der Kolk, as well as any other author or speaker in the world. If any of you guys have an interest in trauma, or you've got some training or worked with trauma, you probably know this name. And when I taught a course about trauma in the MSW program at Ohio State, I used his most recent book as one of our main textbooks. So if you are interested in further reading, which is also at the end of this slideshow, I absolutely recommend starting with his book, primarily his most recent one, The Body Keeps the Score. But anyway, this is a quote of his from a training that I attended. And this is what he had to say about trauma. In fact, the past is the past. And the only thing that matters is what happens right now. And what is trauma is the residue that a past event leaves in your own sensory experiences in your body. And it's not that event out there that becomes intolerable, but the physical sensations with which you live that become intolerable. And you will do anything to make them go away. Now, van der Kolk is talking about a lot of stuff here in a very short paragraph. So we're going to break it down a little bit. The first thing he says that I think is so valuable is when he talks about the fact that we tend to get fixated on the fact that whatever traumatic experience or situation that somebody was in happened before, maybe a long time ago. And I think there's this very understandable urge that we have to tell people to just don't think about it, right? Let it go. And don't worry, for those of you who are parents, I will not sing Let It Go right now. But there's that sense, right? That, well, if you would just let go of it, if you would just move on, if you would get closure, that's one of my favorite ones. And if you've ever worked with people who are grappling with trauma, or perhaps there are people in your life that have experienced this, you know that it's like, oh, all I need to do is not think about it. Great. Why didn't I try that? If it were that simple, none of us would be dealing with trauma. So van der Kolk does a really good job of saying, yes, that event may have happened in the past, but what people are living with now, the symptoms of trauma, the flashbacks, the agitation, which we will spend more time talking about today, that's what causes the problem. It's the after effects now. And so thinking about it like, oh, this person's just dwelling in the past, really misses the point of what trauma is. The next point he makes is that it's in our sensory experiences, what our body senses that tells us that we're safe or we're not safe, and what triggers that alarm system, if you will. That is the change that trauma can make in our nervous system that makes it something that lingers on maybe years or decades after whatever the original trauma was. So in order to talk about that, what I mean when I say sensory experiences, I'm going to tell you a story, and it's a true story from my life, someone that told me this story. It was actually a professor of mine in college, and he later became my advisor and was a really important person for me. So when my professor was a young man, he grew up in rural Ohio, not unlike a lot of areas around where you guys are. And like a lot of young men from the country, when the Vietnam War started, he signed up to go. So he went and volunteered, because that's what you did. You served your country. And he served for a year. And I think he was in his early 20s. And his job that he was assigned to was to be a medic in the field. So for those of you who are not familiar with that, what that means is they would get a call over the radio that there had been fighting. They would jump into a helicopter. They would fly sometimes through really thick jungle canopy trees. And, if they hit a rotor blade on one of those trees, it would break off and they would crash and all die instantly. They would go to where the fighting was, hopefully landing in a safe place. Not always. Hopefully not landing on a landmine, which would blow everyone up. You get it. They would jump out of the helicopter, run out and grab the soldiers and yank them back onto the helicopter. I will not describe to you what he described to us about what sometimes happened when they went to pull the soldiers' bodies away. I will also not describe to you what the inside of that helicopter was like on that flight back to the medical base as they fought to keep the soldiers alive, what he saw, what he experienced, what he smelled, all of that. We won't talk about it. But that's what he did every day for a year. And then he came home and he went to graduate school and he married a nice lady. And then one day here in Columbus, Ohio, he and his wife decided to go to the movies. And the movie that they decided to go see was called The Deer Hunter. And it's an older film now, so some of you may not have heard of it or know anything about it, but it was one of the first very realistic, very graphic descriptions of things that happened in the Vietnam War. And what my professor told us, and generations of students after that, was that the last thing he knew, he was sitting in his movie seat, in his theater seat. He was a PhD professor at that point. And the next thing he knew, he was crouched in the middle of the aisle of the movie theater, screaming, incoming, while his wife and an usher were dragging him out of the theater. Now, you guys didn't know my professor, and he's passed on now, but you'll have to take my word for it when I tell you that he was not thinking about the war or remembering the war, that in those few moments, he was in the war. For those few seconds, he was in it. There was something that he heard or saw on the screen that triggered that in his nervous system, and he was back there for those few seconds. And you'll also have to trust me when I tell you that he did not choose to do that. He did not decide to leap out of his seat and start screaming and disrupt a theater full of strangers and terrify his wife and humiliate himself. Why am I making that point? Because that seems pretty obvious, right? Nobody would choose to do that. Well, I want you all to take a second and I want you to think of that story again, but this time, let's say that instead of someone with a PhD and you know, a career, let's say that he was an individual that you serve and he was on an outing, right, from a group home or whatever. What would he be told when he got back to the house? We know, right? You guys all know. If I were in the room, I could see on your faces, you all know. He would be told, that's the last time you're going on to the movies for a while. You've lost that privilege. Why? Because of your, we could all say it together, poor choices, or because of your behavior. So it's really important to understand that in those few seconds, my professor did not choose or decide. And for me, behavior, the way we usually use that word, means something that I decided to do. If I lift my cup and drink my coffee, it's because I decided to do that. If in the middle of this training, I suddenly had a seizure and I collapsed to the floor and I was convulsing, none of you would be confused about my decision. You know, none of you would be like, what an odd choice she's making right now. You would be very clear that what was happening was out of my conscious control at that moment. And neurologically, what happened to my professor in those few seconds, that flashback, is far closer to a seizure than it is, you know, lifting a cup of coffee. It was not a decision. And yet, many of our individuals are in settings with staff or family members or whomever, who, through no fault of their own, because that looks really, really weird and shocking when someone does that, assume that it's a choice they made, that it was under their control. So it's really, really, really important. And this is why I always spend time with this paragraph rather than going over it quickly, that you guys understand and you become, many of you, the ambassadors, the advocates for your individual who can explain, you know, during a flashback, your whole nervous system and your whole body is telling you that this thing is happening and you're not safe, right? Okay. And the last thing in this paragraph full of really important things, the most important thing, I think, is the last part. When he says it's the physical sensations with which you live, and imagine the fear and horror that would make you leap out of your chair and start screaming, that's pretty intense, right? That become intolerable, and you will do anything to make them go away. And let me tell you what he meant when he said anything. He meant you would drink yourself to sleep every night, you would use drugs, you would compulsively gamble, you would compulsively shop, you would overeat, undereat, cut yourself, burn yourself, have sex with strangers. You would do, if you had no other ways to numb that or make it stop, you would do anything to make it, you'd be aggressive, you'd isolate, whatever it takes, right? And I think of all of these important things in this paragraph, the most important word is the word you. And that's how van der Kolk said it to the audience. He was looking right at us. He said, you, not, if you have mental problems or if you're a messed up vet. He said, you, and he meant you and you and you and Troy and Kevin and me and anybody, anyone. In the right set of circumstances, without other resources, we will do whatever we need to do to make it stop. So remember when I said we are all much, much more like each other than we are different. When we are dealing with people with disabilities of any kind, I think the constant challenge for everything, not just trauma, is to not allow that separation. Wow, you look different from me in this way or that way or some other way. You experience the world differently. You express yourself differently. Wow, we are so different. There are differences. I'm not trying to minimize those, but we have to stay firmly grounded in, I am much, much more like you. Neurodiversity, neurotypical, whatever. Still, I am much, much more like you than I am different from you. And any one of us might do some of the things that some of our individuals do, no matter how bizarre or threatening or frightening or self-harmful or whatever it is. If we lived with that level of fear, that could periodically, sometimes with no warning, take over our bodies. So those are the stakes. That's what we're talking about. And to wrap this up, why I'm so grateful that we get to do this with you guys is really summed up in the last quote here. And Pierre Genet was a 19th century French neurologist who really was one of the pioneering thinkers about what we now know as trauma and how we understand it today. And this is what he said over 100 years ago. Trauma is a disease of not being able to be here. So think about that for a moment. Imagine that I am, starting my first day with a new staff person, and my new staff person, Troy, comes in like, I brought Timbits and, whatever, first day. And I take one look at Troy and I punch him right in the face. Who knows? I don't know. There's something about him that triggers something in me, some trauma in my history, and I lash out, or I, run away and I get in trouble for running out the front door, whatever it is. Was I actually in danger in that moment? Physically really in danger? No, of course not. Of course I wasn't. What's going to happen to me because I reacted the way that I reacted? A whole range of things, right? Anything from, well, I can't have that staff person, I've got to keep looking, or I don't have that placement at that job anymore, or I can't stay at that group home, right? Like you can imagine a wide range of consequences. And really what that means is I don't get to live my life here with what's actually happening. In some cases, as we'll see later, the trauma can be so pervasive that it can affect everything about how I experience myself, how I experience other people who are just trying to help, how I experience the world, how I am in the world. And so your willingness and ADEC's, partnering with us and bringing us in, whether it's training that you get here, hopefully as you go on to learn more and more, your willingness to do that means that you will be able to position yourself as a staff person, as a supervisor, as a manager, as an administrator, as a family member, whatever it is, either directly or in supporting the people who are doing that, to give your individuals the best chance they have at getting to actually be here, to actually live their lives as their true selves. And I can't think of anything more important than that. So I'm really, really, really grateful. And this kind of sets the stage for how I think about trauma and how we're going to be talking about it. Okay, so much to talk about. Very briefly, I will just say this. We're not going to spend a lot of time on definitions, but I will say it's easy to think about trauma as anything that overwhelms your normal coping system. Okay, so it's the difference between getting a flat tire and knowing how to change a flat tire and being able to get out of your car and put the new tire on and drive on your way, stressful, but you can manage it, versus you get a flat tire and it's the middle of the night and you don't know where you are and it's really spooky and you don't know when someone's going to come along to help you. Right? See, that second scenario may or may not cause trauma, but we can already see that it's overwhelmed what you usually know what to do. And every single organism, from the tiniest little amoeba up to human beings, has that reaction to their environment. I feel safe, I don't feel safe, right? That is deeply written into our nervous system, into our DNA over hundreds of millions of years. We could talk more about that, but we're going to keep going. So we're going to talk a little bit before the break about different kinds of events that can cause different effects on the brain and body. So this first group, we sometimes refer to as big T or capital T traumas. These are events that are so out of the norm for anybody's coping that they can potentially become traumatic. It depends on the individual. Not everyone will experience full-blown PTSD after one of these events, but we just kind of get it in our gut that if you experience something like this, chances are good that you may have ongoing issues with it. So sexual assault, physical assault, verbal or emotional abuse, manipulation, war. War is actually usually at the forefront of how we understand trauma, and then we kind of catch up afterwards. Man-made or natural disasters, catastrophic illness, traumatic loss, humiliation and bullying. You guys get it, right? Captivity. Any of these things, if I told you that I had experienced something on this list and that I had symptoms of PTSD or that I'd been diagnosed with PTSD, you'd be like, yep, that sounds right. You know, we kind of get that. And there are some factors that can make an event more or less likely to potentially cause trauma. So most of these are pretty common sense. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. And again, keep in mind, you guys will have the manual, and you know, if anything feels like we're going too fast, we can also go back and talk more about it. But as I said, a lot of this is pretty sensible, right? How long did it last? Was it a few seconds? Was it a few hours? Was it days? How intense was it? What time of day? Interestingly, you can take the same event, and if it happens at night or daytime, people tend to find it more stressful at night, I think, because it's harder to orient and know what's going on. Was there any warning? Was someone intentionally trying to harm you? All of that stuff. Probably the most significant factor in the research for whether someone is likely to develop PTSD or not after a stressful event is the support system they have around them during and especially after the event. So think for a moment, and this is where, as I said, we'll look not at having a disability somehow makes you a different kind of human being, but the situation that many people with disabilities are in starts to impact their vulnerability. So think about the folks you guys support. Do they all have wonderful, natural support systems of tons of people who know and love them? Do they have lots of access to counseling and treatment after some kind of traumatic event? No, we already know the answer is no. Some lucky few do, many do not. So we're already starting to see how that vulnerability comes into play. We also know that there are some factors about the individual, any one of us, that could make us more or less vulnerable to ongoing effects from a traumatic event. So a previous history of traumas, any kind of history that we have of, I don't love the word mental illness here, but let's just say any kind of mental or emotional challenge or struggle. We know that resilience probably has a genetic component. There are some people that we've actually identified a couple of genes that may be involved, which is why, you know, even in the same family, you can have a long or a short pair on that gene. And if any of you have worked with a family or generations of families, as I did when I was in child welfare, you know, you can take the same kids, essentially the same situation that they're all growing up in, and some kids walk out of that kind of okay, and some kids are not okay, like sizzling hot mess. Genetics may be in play there. And again, at the end of the list, we'll look at this, that difficult relationships or poor attachment to others puts you already at higher risk for the impact of trauma, especially if the trauma that we're talking about was caused by another person. And that is almost exclusively the trauma we're talking about with your population. We're not talking about military PTSD. We're not talking about someone who is in a flood or a mine caved in. That's possible, of course, but generally what we're talking about is abuse or mistreatment from other human beings. Now, there is one thing on this list that, as much as I want to get through this material quickly and use our time, we have to talk about this. So at the top of this list, I went over it kind of quickly at first, and it may not have gotten your attention. Previous history of trauma or stressors or abuse. And that kind of makes sense, right? If you've already been impacted, more probably makes it harder to bounce back from. Makes sense. However, there are times when I have heard people talk about someone who's had a tremendous amount of trauma, and then I'm told that, well, they're tough, they're a survivor. And that's not to say that we don't develop resilience after traumas and post-traumatic growth. We do. But here's what I have seen, that we view some people in our society as vulnerable and some people as dangerous. Let me explain. As I said, I started my career working a lot with adolescents and their families, and I worked with rich kids and poor kids and in-between kids and kids from urban settings and kids from rural settings, all of it. And later, in my career, when I wasn't doing agency work anymore, I was contracted by a mental health agency for teenagers to review charts. Won't get into why. They had a supervisor leave unexpectedly. They had a backlog of like 200 cases. And what I needed to do was go through, read the history, read the diagnosis, and sign off on it. Pretty simple. So I would, sit down a couple hours a day and do that. And I got a chance to see what I had long suspected. I would read histories of kids, and some of them had trauma after trauma after trauma, exposure to violence, poverty, multiple disruptions early in life, all of the stuff, mistreatment, being taken away by children's services, put in foster care, all of the stuff, right? And what I saw was that if it was a child of color, in this agency, primarily Black kids, they did have some kids from other ethnicities, and especially a boy. Guess how often those kids were given a diagnosis of PTSD? Out of 200 cases. Here's the answer. 0. Not one. Once I started noticing this, I went back and I made sure and I kept track. Not one boy of color with a history of trauma was PTSD even a rule out. I won't bore you guys with diagnosis, but that means when you're not quite sure what's going on and maybe it's this and maybe it's that. No. And this confirmed what research has also confirmed for us over and over again. This is not in question. There are many, many studies out there that confirm this, that girls, especially white girls, are more likely with the same set of symptoms to be given an emotional diagnosis: depression, anxiety, PTSD. Boys, especially boys of color, are more likely to be given a behavioral diagnosis: oppositional defiant disorder, which, by the way, I think is nonsense and doesn't exist. I think it's misdiagnosed trauma usually, or other problems. Just my thought. But oppositional defiant, ADHD, conduct disorder, intermittent explosive disorder. I would love someone to explain to me what the heck that's supposed to be. But anyway, the point is, for some people, we look at their behavior. For other people, we look at their feelings. Some people are allowed to be sad, and some people are looked at as bad. And I promise you that in your population of folks you work with, some of them, whether you look at the sex and gender differences or the racial differences, some of them are impacted by this bias. You will read diagnoses and go, oh, okay. But the people who give diagnoses, me and you and every other clinician, everybody, we're all human. We all have our own experiences and biases. Some of them we're not aware of. And we know that impacts diagnosis of people at times. So keep in mind that if you are working with that population, the chances that they have been skewed towards behavioral versus the damage of trauma is very real. And if I sound upset about it, it's just because I'm really upset about it. So it's really important to me that we talk about this. Okay, moving on. Now we talked about the big T traumas, the things that are hopefully really unusual, extraordinary stresses that for anybody could be considered potentially traumatizing. Okay, now we're going to look at some other stuff. So everybody look at this list for a second. Feeling different from the other people around you, not being accepted by others, not being able to do stuff other people seem to do easily, having major changes in your life, not feeling that anyone is listening to you or feeling misunderstood. When you look at this list, you might be asking yourself, why is this in a trauma presentation? Right? Because after all, I could have labeled this slide 7th grade, right? All of us at times in our lives have felt these things. In fact, if anybody in this audience has never felt anything on this list, please email me because I want to talk to you and find out what your life is like. It sounds great. So if these things are just kind of part of what it means to be human, why would we call it a trauma? Well, with this list of things, it's not the intensity, right? It is the frequency. And I want to go into a little more depth with that. So we'll talk about this a little bit longer, and then we'll probably take a pause and take our break. I want you to pick something on this list. Let's say, let's pick failing at a task. All right. And I'm not going to ask you guys to share this with anyone at your table or anything like this. This is just for you. But I want you to pause for a minute. If you've been taking notes or secretly checking your email or whatever, just stop for a second. And I want you to think about a time that you failed at something. And let's say that it was something important to you. It really, you really needed to succeed at this. So it wasn't like, oh, I guess water skiing's not for me, but like you know, it was important to you and you tried hard. Maybe other people saw you fail. How did that feel? And I know when I talk to audiences and I ask them a question like this, I watch everyone's faces and I know what I would see if I could see all of you guys today. I would see this. Didn't feel good, right? And I also know something about you without having talked to many of you. And that is that you're pretty good at not failing at stuff. You probably hated how that felt. And you probably, most if not all of you, have a couple of things in your favor. Number one, you hopefully have at least some people in your life who are not paid to be there. And that is nothing against staff or therapists or anything like that, but people who are naturally in your life who love and care about you, who are there to cheer you on, right? Don't worry, you'll get them next time. I think you're awesome. And you probably also have some resources to find a way to turn it into a success. Either you study harder for that exam and then you pass it the next time, or you figure out this is not the path for me and you go in a different direction. Great, all good. You have a way of dealing with this so that it is an infrequent event. But now I want you to think about the people that you support. Look at this list again. How many times did these folks experience these feelings? Once a year? Once a month? Once a day? Many of the folks we support, you know this, they feel this all day, every day. Do they have a natural cheering squad of people who are in their lives because they choose to be, not that because it's their job, no matter how nice professionals are, and they have lots and lots of opportunities to do it a different way and experience success? Do your folks have lots and lots of that in their lives typically? No, they don't. It's as if 7th grade never ends. Your worst day of 7th grade, every day, forever. So what happens is any one of these little events in and of itself may not be such a big deal, but when you add it up, hour after hour, day after day, year after year, what starts to happen is that stress acts on the brain and the nervous system like the stress of a single catastrophic event. And so when you look at it cumulatively, the changes start to look the same. My favorite quote about this actually is from a friend of mine who is a retired lieutenant from the Ohio Highway Patrol, who now is known nationally, I think, as a speaker for law enforcement and first responders, helping them to understand trauma and their exposure to it. So this is how he likes to explain it to them. Big T is like being attacked by a bear, and little t is like being attacked by ducks. Okay, so you can imagine what I love about this image is that one bear attack, yeah, you would just need one bear and they could do a lot of damage. If it were just one duck that you had to deal with occasionally, and I'm a little bit afraid of ducks, but you could probably handle that, right? But now imagine hundreds of ducks every day. The damage really starts to be indistinguishable. And why we're talking about that is that we know, well, I think this is what we'll wrap up on, is this concept that I want you guys to take into your break and think about. We already know that people with developmental disabilities are more vulnerable to big T. They have higher rates of big T traumas. They are more vulnerable to being exploited, trafficked, mistreated, neglected, assaulted. We already know that, right? Now, what we also know is that they have a much higher incidence of little T trauma and most of the time, much fewer resources to deal with it. For both cases, right? Fewer resources. So when we look at what is the incidence of traumatic stress in our population, some estimates are higher than 90% of individuals we work with have had some exposure to potentially traumatizing stress. Higher than 90%. So when we come back, we will talk about what is happening when people are exposed to potentially traumatic stress, and how do we address the fact that it might be essentially everyone we work with. Okay, so here's where we're going to pause. This is a great time to let folks know if you've got questions. I will check that comment section when we come back from our break. We will take a, let's see, it is 10:30. I'm going to shorten the break a teeny bit. So, because we started a little bit later, so we will take a 7-minute break and we will come back here at 10:37, and I will see you guys then.